Hi everyone, this is Samit Sarkar on Friends List with you today. I've got a very special guest, one who will be familiar to those of you in podcast land. He's our reviews editor, Arthur Gies. How's it going, Arthur?
It's Friday. That's
Yes,
exciting.
it sure is, especially because we have a 3-day weekend.
Yes, although I will be working this entire weekend, sadly.
Oh no. Well, video games, right?
Yes, video games.
Yes, and that's what we're here to talk about. Specifically, we're talking about release schedules on this episode of Friends List. I think a lot of people, wonder why are there always these periods, certain periods around the year where you see a glut of game releases all packed together in 1 month or a few weeks. And you, as our reviews editor, I thought would be a great person to talk to about this stuff since you're keenly aware of release date schedules all the time. You have to be. Well, first off, I guess we'll start with a basic question. What seems to you, Arthur, to be the times of year when it's most common for game releases to get really bunched up together?
Well, I know this year, October is definitely looking like the busiest month. I think that there's something like 6 or 7 very high-profile games already with release dates in October, and games that traditionally release in October, like Assassin's Creed, I don't think have release dates yet, so it only stands to reason that there will be more of that.
Hmm.
Uh, Generally speaking, the period between September and the end of November is the most busy when it comes to release dates. And then there are other sort of spots throughout the year that are punctuated with a high number of releases. January is usually dead, February gets a little busier, and then March is usually totally bananas.
Hmm.
And then April will be quiet, and May will again see a sudden surge in games, which is actually a pretty recent trend that I think Rockstar kind of started with Red Dead Redemption. So uh, those are the sort of like prime traffic areas for game releases right now.
Okay, cool. Well, so what do we have so far, for example, in October this year?
Oh, geez. I'm going to bring up a calendar really quick. But right off the bat, I think we've got Shadows of Mordor, which is the new Lord of the Rings game. We've got Evolve, which was announced for October yesterday. We've got Alien Isolation, WWE 2K15. Batman Arkham Knight is October 14th. NBA 2K15 is October 7th. Drive Club is October 7th. Dragon Age Inquisition is October 7th. Skylanders is October 5th. So there's a lot of stuff coming out in October, and we don't even have release dates for most things yet.
So, are you looking to hire anyone between now and October for the reviews team?
Oh man, no, we're just gonna abuse everyone that works on staff as much as we are capable of doing to try to get that stuff done. But there's the crappy thing is it makes us prioritize very strictly as to what we can or can't cover, and the games that get squeezed out are the smaller games. And unfortunately, the more games that come out in a particular time, the more strict our definition of bigger game quote, which is how we sort of determine our coverage priorities because we need to cover the stuff that people are actually looking for as much as possible because we're a business. The more games coming out, the stricter our definition of what a game we absolutely have to cover has to become.
Sure. Those periods that you mentioned earlier, October and then May and also March, were you generally speaking about just sort of big budget AAA games, or do those months tend to also see a ton of indie game releases?
I feel like a fair amount of indies try to squeeze out in that fall period because they're very sort of specific behavioral patterns that dictate um, when games get released. At least that's what publishers think. In indies, although they try to do things differently in a lot of ways, they try to replicate what they see larger publishers doing a lot of the time. So I'm sure that there will be indie games announced for October, for example, because it happened last year too. And it will be incredibly difficult for us to get to them because of how much other stuff is coming out.
So you see this clustering happening in the months that you mentioned. What do you see as the main reason for that?
Well, historically, and I'm talking like in the 80s and then the 90s, the like publishers and developers would release games around that time because that's typically when Christmas shopping started. That parents would buy games to hold on to until Christmas to give to their kids, and also stuff like Hanukkah. And so that created this historical pattern where people expected games to come out towards the end of the year because that's when people bought them for Christmas. And now it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy because it's not just parents buying games for their kids, obviously. Like the gaming audience has gotten older and has more buying power on its own, so people don't wait for their parents to buy them video games anymore. In a lot of cases, although that's obviously not always true. And as we get towards the end of the year, I think you'll see a lot of kid-friendly games come out on certain platforms that expect to be bought and banked for holidays. So I think that there's that sort of expectation that that's when people are buying games because that's when they've been conditioned to buy games. With regards to something like March and February, like early in the year games, a lot of companies have their financial results in mid to late March, and they want to have a big launch to talk about on their financial results call with their investors. And May as a release window, I think that that's just a case of developers seeing that a game was incredibly successful in that spot. And in this case, I'm talking about Red Dead Redemption and trying to replicate that, like feeling like there is space for one big May game every year. And that's like the last chance also that you've got to release a game that's been talked about a lot before E3. And I think something like Watch Dogs, as for an example, the delay of Watch Dogs screwed up a lot of PR plans and a lot of announcement plans for Ubisoft. And any new game that Ubisoft talks about that's not Watch Dogs distracts from Watch Dogs, which needs to be a pretty big success for them. I mean, you as a reporter saw how much of a hit on their bottom line delaying Watch Dogs out of November was last year.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can't generate hype and potential sales waiting for, say, the next Assassin's Creed by talking about that game before Watch Dogs comes out. And they can't take Watch Dogs to another E3. It's already been to two. And it's old news at this point. So May is a chance to get out ahead of that, to get out ahead of the hype for new games, like which is where a lot of excitement rests.
Sure. And you have also seen in a few cases, publishers, I think, whether intentionally or because stuff happened in terms of maybe delays in development, sometimes you've seen them go outside of that schedule and the
Right.
typical months you mentioned and have success. I mean, I think Far Cry 3 was like an early December game, which was really
Far
surprising to a
Cry
lot of
3
people.
was December 4th, I think,
Okay.
which, to be totally honest, when that date was announced, I was skeptical, and a lot of people I talked to were skeptical that Far Cry 3 was going to really click, because that was 2012, and there was a lot of stuff coming out in 2012. You had Assassin's Creed 3, which, whatever you may think of its quality, was a pretty significant game release. You had Halo 4, you had Black Ops 2, you had the Wii U launching as well, like, uh, and all of its launch games. So it didn't feel like there was a ton of oxygen in the room for a game releasing in the beginning of December.
Hmm.
And I don't know if I'd say lucky for Ubisoft, but thankfully for that game, it reviewed really well. And I think it got a lot of people talking about it that otherwise wouldn't have. And so it's been a pretty significant success for Ubisoft in the wake of that. But a lot of games have tried to release in December and don't get the traction. And pretty much the only company I can think of that really successfully launches games in December is Nintendo.
Hmm. Well, speaking of games like that, do you think that it's a death sentence or indicative of maybe a lack of confidence when you see a publisher release a game outside of those typical months? I mean, you hear sometimes analysts will say, "Oh, that game's sent to die because it's either out of the schedule or put up against a whole bunch of other games."
Um, I mean, it's a conundrum because on the one hand, if you're a publisher, you want to release a game when people have the most likelihood of buying it, and taken out of all context, that should be September, October, or November. Um, and it used to not be September. Microsoft really made September a time when people released games with the release of Halo 3 in 2007. And since then, you've seen games capitalize on a wider window for stuff. But the thing is, everybody thinks that that's when games sell, and it's true that that is when most games sell. Like, it's a pretty significant percentage, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70%, I think, of a year's game totals for everyone comes in that 3-month period. But the problem is when you have that many games releasing, it's a really bloody competition for attention and for limited budgets. So the idea is to try to find a place where people can focus on that game and really get into it and buy it, because there's not as much competition, because everything is relational. Like, there's a lot of give and take and back and forth. And looking at the October release calendar right now, there's no doubt in my mind that there are games that are currently scheduled for October that will be delayed. Because that's what always happens, because it's the smart thing to do sometimes, to move out of a very crowded month. And if I had to guess, I would say that there are games coming out in October that will come out in January or February instead.
Hmm. Well, when you look at the sort of way that these games are clustered, doesn't it make sense then for publishers to look at some of these other months? I mean, obviously, you mentioned the holiday purchasing power argument, but there are plenty of months that are usually dead season. You mentioned January sometimes, and certainly the summer months can be dry, July especially. So why wouldn't someone say, "Hey, we think we've got a great game. Let's put it out when nothing else is coming out"?
I think it's because there have been pretty good games that have sort of smashed themselves against the rocks of a summer release that just haven't found any success. And I think last year was a pretty good example of a very crowded August. There were some pretty high-profile games that came out in August, including Splinter Cell Blacklist, Saints Row 4, and Lost Planet 3. And Splinter Cell has never really set the world on fire sales-wise, but it's done generally well. But everything I've heard is that Splinter Cell Blacklist was considered a pretty big disappointment sales-wise. Saints Row did really well out of the gate, but it didn't really have the legs that a lot of games do, by which I mean it didn't keep selling after that initial release month the way that a lot of other games do. And Lost Planet 3 just crashed really hard. So the thing is, when developers try to release games in those months, a lot of times they fail. And the hesitance to release games in those periods previously has been about behavioral patterns for people that video game companies think are their consumers. And specifically, families go on vacation during the summer, or kids are outside playing. They're not at school, so they're not playing as many video games. And whether that's true or not, because obviously there's a lot of different lifestyles happening all over the world and in this country that don't necessarily mean that that's accurate. It does seem to be borne out in sales performance for titles during those periods.
Okay. Well, for you as a reviews editor, I mean, this seems like an obvious answer, but would you prefer games to be spread out much more evenly over the course of a year?
I would like it if we always had a reliable amount of stuff to do, but that's just not what happens. And it's not just this way with video games. I mean, movies follow very similar release patterns in some regards. Like the beginning of the year is when studios take out the trash, and then there's a slow period in February and March, and then stuff starts to amp up around April, and then get really busy over the summer, and then slow down in September before they sort of ramp up again in October and November and December. So as a media critic or whatever you want to call it, I don't I don't expect that will be the thing that happens. The the issue is that as long as game release schedules stay as sort of sharply focused as they are, that there are going to be good games that get squeezed out because there's just not enough money to go around to make everything a success.
Well, so you mentioned earlier that indies a lot of times, they if they're aiming for these crowded months, they're just going to fall by the wayside in terms of potential review coverage. So what would your big advice be to indie developers looking to get their games covered?
I mean, strictly speaking, looking at when big games release, the best times for indie games to me seem to be January and February are not crowded with major releases. March is a terrible idea for an indie developer. April is a little more quiet. May gets busier. And then June and July are also fairly quiet months that I think have some space for indie games to get attention, because there are so few high-profile games at those points that people are looking for something to keep them occupied. And that's not to say that indie games can't be just as engrossing and captivating as a big AAA game, but they just don't have the same kind of acquisitive buzz behind them that the AAA games do.
For me, we've been talking about publishers picking release dates. Part of the reason I love sports games so much is that they're reliable. You can always count on them to be out around the start of the season. For the respective sports. Companies sometimes have shuffled things around. Tiger Woods used to come out, I think, like August, and then they moved it to late March just to put it out right before the Masters tournament. That was, right when they got the Masters in the game. And, I think this summer it's unfortunate that we're not going to have an NCAA football game in July, so there's kind of
probably ever. We'll probably never get another NCAA football game, but that's a different conversation.
Yes. But for me, I always like the idea of not only do I have the actual seasons to look forward to, NFL kickoff every September, now I also know, hey, every August, I'm going to get Madden as well to go along with it. So that's always at least a bedrock to rely upon in the release schedule. And I think with that, we're going to close it out, unless you have any other thoughts, Arthur?
Hey, game devs, stop announcing stuff in October.
It sounds like a plan. All right, well, thanks, Arthur, for coming on the show with me. Thanks to all of our listeners, our viewers, and our readers. We'd like you to keep commenting on our posts, with questions, and certainly review us on iTunes. That'd be great. Head to youtube.com/Polygon for tons more awesome video content, including episodes of Friends List. And have a great Memorial Day weekend. We'll see you next week.